often and early. You will grow so much in your coursework and experiences, and your portfolio and resume when you're a sophomore will look very different when you're a senior. Help yourself out and start building those materials well before that last semester of school. So there were just over 550 people registered for the event. There will be a quick Q&A at the close of the presentation around 6:45. Kelly Evans, Education Chair, will be monitoring the questions, assessing the duplicates, and pulling questions for me in the allotted time. Please know that we will not be able to answer every question. We're currently sitting at about 210 participants right now. This is the agenda for the presentation. Okay, so let's dig in. What is a case study? A case study is a story. Each story provides a challenge and approach, a solution, and the result. And when you follow that structure, you demonstrate what hiring managers want to see most. Your approach to solving problems, overall process, technical skill, and the ability to communicate. So you want to consider first your audience. Who will be looking at your work? Hiring managers, recruiters, potential clients. In each case, they are looking at your work for more than skills in design and typography, though those are essential. They want to learn about how you work and how you communicate. Part 1, write your case study first. So start with a written narrative. Create an outline and fill in the details, and consider the following sections: a client overview, the problem you solved, project goals, process description, and outcomes. Now, in looking at this structure, always write in an active voice, which means the subject performs the action by the verb. So for example, I conducted research and provided an identity and design system for the corner store grocery. Just keep that in mind as you're thinking about these sections, that you want to be writing in that active voice, not a passive voice. So let's dig in on the structure. So a project will likely have a title, something that reflects the client and what they needed, like corner store, grocery brand, and identity. Now, as an advisor, I'll often see things like Graphic Design 3 branding project. So this might be helpful for your coursework and for your instructor, but not for a potential employer. You want clarity on what the project is. Then likely a hero image. So this is going to be an image that quickly sums up the core of the work. This is likely showing a brand and application interacting in the world, and we'll talk a bit more about that later. Client overview. Who is the client? Some brief intro to who the client is and what they do. From there, define the problem that you're solving. What were they in need of? Identity, design system. This is where you might highlight project goals. What is the scope of the project? It might be an identity, but who are you applying it to? What are you applying it to? Print collateral, posters, a website, social strategy, and content. Define the scope of the project. And then process. How did you get your results? And what were the iterations like? How was it refined? Show the final design. And then the outcomes. So this is the final design and the impact on the world. For example, if the project had a social strategy, did the design work that you did reflect in an increase of Instagram followers? You would want to note that in your outcomes. So this is the basic structure for potential components. This is by no means a formula that you need to follow. These are just the components that could be applicable to your project. Now, it could look like this. It could also look like this, with significant more storytelling and emphasis on the research. Maybe final images are at the end. You know, it could be more images of the documentation of that research, and then the final design. You know, there is no formula for this. These are just the components. Now, something that's important to note here is that anytime you use images, be sure to caption it. If someone is spending just a few seconds running their eyes over your case study, it's likely that they would be looking for context for the images. So it's best practice to caption everything. So here's an example of a project that is common in a student portfolio. So in publication design, you might have a 2-page layout exercise. That's not a full page publication, just 2 spreads, 4 pages. The student could choose, for this particular brief, the student could choose an existing article and a famous designer, in this case, Ellen Lupton, and then the project brief outlined a challenge curating content to fit strict guidelines, including the specific length of body copy, amount of photography captions, and pull quotes. So in presented this way, you might want to look at our structure, and having a client overview isn't necessary here. This isn't, there isn't a persona that you're creating this for. So you'd likely want to focus on the problems you solved and the parameters around the challenge, identifying the criteria for the brief and then the goals for the 2-spread layout. You could include the iterations for your process and then the final result. So back to our example, the goal would be to effectively communicate your challenge and solution, but do those PDFs of the spreads visually communicate your intent? We're going to get to that next. So part 2, visual components. So here we are back at our case study structure, and now we're going to focus on the images that you would use in your case study. So you want to show your intent. Your work is meant to live in the real world, interacting with audiences across a variety of channels. In the case of this brand for a bakery, there are images that show a setting in a bakery with baking tools and a logo on an apron that starts to set a real tone. Accompany that with images of applicable products, and you really start to tell a story. So for photographing your projects, you can document and showcase both physical and digital projects with effective photography. You're going to want to pay attention to color, lighting, angles, symmetry, and contextual elements like hands and environment. So here we have examples of some photographed print pieces. You're going to see some publication, various print collateral, all represented in either one or a few images. Even though each piece took time to create, it isn't necessary to photograph them or show them individually. Use the images in your case study to build that story and show them as a cohesive unit. So it's about time for me to say my favorite thing that I tell students. Your portfolio isn't your work. It's a collection of stories with pictures of your work. You get to build that narrative and set that tone. And the way you do that is what a potential employer or hiring manager is assessing. So back to the photography. For suggested equipment, here's a list of some things that, that you could gather to be able to photograph maybe in your home. If you have a DSLR, great, but a smartphone camera is just fine. Something that's going to be capable of creating at minimum images that are 5 by 7 inches at 300 DPI. A tripod or a mount, paper in different color and sizes, themed props that make sense in that setting, think in terms of the bakery tools, white cardstock or foam board to bounce that light, and then a window, just a window for daylight. So I found some great documentation on photographing your work on Lettering Daily, just so you have a visual. Here you can see a setup that's by a window where they're bouncing the light with that big white card over the scene. There's multiple props and a use of color paper for the background. They have a tripod set up over the table. And here's the same setup through an iPhone. You can see the scene is styled as needed. And it's just a quick tabletop of a piece of product. And here's a same piece with different background options. So you can be strategic with the way that you photograph your work so that it's consistent from one project to the next. Then your portfolio will feel cohesive. So if you're showing some print collateral for one project and you use a background color and various props, maybe for the next project, you might do something similar so they do feel like that they go together. Now for mock-ups. You know, there are mock-up templates for almost everything: computer screens, phones, t-shirts, publications, business cards, billboards, product packaging, and more. Mock-ups allow viewers from hiring managers to potential clients to visualize how your work might look in the real world. It's a helpful tool to communicate your idea. So some great resources for mock-ups. You can create your own. You can take an image, modify it, use smart objects and set that up to make your own sort of shadows and details to make it look like it's a real photograph of the piece. You can also use something like Creative Market. And additionally, if you were creating your own, you could likely sell on Creative Market as well. I like Creative Market because there's a huge library and you can find things that are $2 or $20 or $200 based on what you're looking for in various packages. So it's something I use a lot. Additionally, there are other platforms like Pixidin, Graphic Burger, Mockups, Adobe Stock Templates. There's a lot of different things that you can use. So let's talk about how to use mockups and why they're important, or why just documenting your work well is important. So I'll often see a presentation with a flat JPEG representing the work. The problem here is that I have no sense of scale or what it even actually is. This could read as a postcard. It could read as, you know, as a sign. It could read as a business card, but it's actually a poster. So consider presenting it that way. An image like this gives me a sense of scale. It shows me a presence that this piece actually has in the world. And don't forget typographic detail. Someone making a decision about hiring you absolutely needs to be able to read your type. You have an image of the poster mocked up, but it's imperative that you have one or two type details so they can see your choices in hierarchy and be able to read it clearly. So presented this way, this could be a poster, a postcard, or a business card. It's hard to tell. It's actually a cover for a publication. Now in this image, we see a cover and then we see the publication open to show one spread. This gives me way more information about the actual size and also the number of pages and the presence of this real publication. So publication design can be tricky. They can be 8 pages, 40 pages, 400 pages, but nobody wants to look through pages of every spread that you created. You'll need to curate what you want to show to be strategic about the spreads that you're showing. So you could pick something that is showing some great hierarchy for a QA format in like an interview. Spreads that primarily are images or illustrations. You're showing the variations of the grid and how it supports in that content. So when you're sequencing, just pick 5 to 7 images to show that. Something that is going to summarize the feel that you created for the publication. But again, not every single page. You know, another thing to note here is that when you're in an interview, you can easily hand somebody that publication to have more of a deep dive. But this kind of goes back to, this is just pictures of your work. This is not all of the work. And since you only have that attention span for just a small while, be strategic about what you're showing. And again, you need that typographic detail to be represented in a couple of images. It needs to be tight enough to read the copy and see those choices. You know, in publication, you're looking at headers, subheaders, you have body copy, there's pull quotes, there's captions. There's a lot of different things that you're making decisions and choices about, and people need to be able to see those. So a few images that are going to be tight to show that. So for web, using a mock like this can be helpful to show how the design is responsive in multiple devices. To dig in on that, think about creating a web page and showing off the design for web. So be careful with linking to a real site and sending people away from your portfolio. This is just pictures of your work again. So this can be just as tricky as it is for print. Presented this way, this could be a postcard, a poster. The image isn't clearly representing what this is. By adding a simple gray rectangle and 3 circles, now I see a browser bar and it reads as it's supposed to be intended. And for user interface and in user experience, you can use images of a flow chart to show how a sequence of an interaction and how it works. This is especially helpful in process. And there are also mocks that can be helpful to show the styled prototype. So as a career advisor for designers, in almost every job description I see the responsibility for creating social content under the job duties. I'll also say additionally, I see presentation design. So decks, working in Keynote and PowerPoint are also something that's repeated over and over again in entry-level positions. So showing example of this in your portfolio is extremely helpful to demonstrate that for potential employers. So here you see some content for Instagram. First, there's a text and graphic or illustration components. Then there's an image and text, and then an image and graphic element. This image doesn't tell me a whole lot about how these are being used. But now you can see the copy that accompanies the post, and you can see how it's meant to be used in the strategy. You could take this a step further and actually show a top 9 and show how the images in Instagram are sequenced or where the strategy is for that. And here, you can see that the first is a show announcement based on the copy. The second is announcing an artist takeover. So this would be consistently used for that. So this image of the social strategy tells way more of a story. All right, now back to our example. After clearly writing out the challenge and solution for this project, now it's time to determine the visual components. So here again, we have sort of the PDF spreads. And now we have them in a mock that show them how they would live in the world. And so you really only need these 2 images to show the overview of two spreads. But then a tight detail so that you can easily see the typographic details. And then really it's just those 3 images for a project like this and a project this size. So on this site, when you start to put the case study out in a website, the project starts out by providing that context for the challenge and solution, highlighting some process, and then sequencing the images and the spreads. So the case study ends up looking something like that. Again, this is pointing to a very typical student project, something that you might want to showcase, but isn't as big as, say, a brand or building out a full website where there's multiple components. But here's a way, if you're just building out student assignments and shaping them to be on your site, here's a way to think about presenting them. Now, part 3, portfolio presentation. So here are some web portfolio best practices. I recommend no holding page, land directly on the portfolio. You don't want any barrier. If you are submitting this with 100 other applications that are in there, you want it to be as easy as possible for a hiring manager or recruiter to get right to your site. Now, also you want a website that's going to be easy to navigate, that it's easy to find the work, it's easy to find a way to contact you. So that's an incredibly important part. It's great to have a section that has a contact form, but somewhere put an email in there so that they can easily find that if they're pulling web addresses and emails to have somebody else look at it. So like a recruiter might, you want to make it easy for them to find the information. It should be responsive. There should be an About Me section that says who you are, what you do, and where you live as the base of the content. And then of course expand from there. And then your resume. So the resume could be set in web content. You could lay out the information under that kind of a About Me section, or you can have a downloadable PDF for the resume. Additionally, all of the social links like LinkedIn, Instagram, things like that that you're using professionally, you would also want to have linked on your website. And suggested platforms, Adobe Portfolio and Squarespace. So I recommend Adobe Portfolio because it's part of Creative Cloud and it's great. And Squarespace is 50% off for students, which is also amazing. And Squarespace has a nice cart feature. So if you're doing a lot of illustration or have things that you want to sell through your site, it's a nice system to use. So here's a basic layout with a grid of projects and a simple navigation. This is bare bones, just kind of giving a visual to how you would think about setting up this site. And so here you can see an example of Adobe Portfolio layout. Again, just a grid of projects. And here I really want you to take notice of how this person, Emily, designed for the template. I recommend making a cover image for each of the projects, not taking a detail out of an existing image. Oftentimes that can make it be really abstract and it's hard to tell what's happening, but you want to clearly communicate the project. You're going to get the most eyes on this page. So you want to design for the template. So here on the very first project, you can see that we're going to see some social content. This is part of a brand. Below that looks to be spread for a publication. There's print collateral for the Frank 8 project, which is to the right of it. And then below it, it looks like it's a brand for a restaurant. Just in a quick glance, you clearly understand what it is you're looking at. And having some rollover titles that are the same title of your project can be helpful too. But just remember the most views are going to happen on this page as they make a decision over the quality of your work. So printed portfolio best practices. Okay, so I like to tell students to be prepared with both a web portfolio as well as a printed portfolio. And you want to treat this version of your portfolio as a printed publication. So set it up the same way you would a publication. This is a great way for you to have a printed portfolio that's curated to specific opportunities. So if you were applying to a firm that primarily does strategy and brand, you'd be bringing that work to the top. If you were applying for a position that was all book cover design, this would be a way for you to set and curate those projects and to show, demonstrate evidence of that work by showing examples of book covers. The reason why I want people to be prepared with this is because in various systems where you're applying, sometimes they're looking for a website, but they're also looking for you to upload work examples. And when they are looking for that, it should be in this format. So again, curated, scaled for legibility, and there should be a table of contents. Now, I would recommend no more than 6 projects in a printed portfolio. And again, those curated 6 projects towards whatever you're at, like pointed towards whatever you're after. So right away on the first page, there should be that contact info. How would they get a hold of you? So it would be your name, your website, your phone number. And then when you're setting up the master pages of the publication, right when you're setting up your page numbers set in your footer somewhere, I would put your name and your website and your phone number on every page. Even if it's a light gray and it's 6-point font, like it would still be set in the design so that somebody, if they pulled the page because they like what they saw, could easily find you. So the contact info, needs to be there. And then your resume should be in the back of the publication. So be prepared for this to be a PDF and ready to submit. Or in some cases, there are people in the industry that would be expecting a printed and bound copy. It's not as common, but it is something to kind of be prepared for. Here's an example of what that could look like. All right, part 4, industry research. So you need to do your research. Play to your audience. How do the studios you admire present their work? And studios feature case studies on their own websites and across their social media channels. What is important for them to show? How do they communicate their process? What do they show in application? And what design details do they show? So there are a lot of really excellent tools out there to help you to figure this out. As students, you should be consuming work and compiling a list of agencies and studios and brands that really speak to you. What work really excites you? Who did it and where do they work? So Instagram has become an amazing portfolio platform. It's one of the first places I go to look at work now. If it could be an illustrator, it could be a game artist, whoever it is, I'm looking to see what they're doing on Instagram because it's very on demand in terms of the work. Oftentimes there'll be things that there's an expansion of what's on a portfolio site on Instagram. And so it's really become more of an industry standard. So, which designers do you follow on Instagram? What type of work do they do? How are they presenting it in Instagram? And then you can utilize things like LinkedIn to be able to see where people work. What are their roles? What is the way a studio is set up in terms of those roles? Is there a design director, a senior designer, a designer and a junior designer? Like you can really use LinkedIn to your benefit to really understand the industry and to understand a company that you'd like to be at. And then of course, simply just Googling, finding those portfolio sites, finding work, finding different things that they might be doing. Additionally, AIGA is an excellent resource tool. Just looking at the member directory. If you're a member, you're also able to upload portfolios just to be able to look at work. So in addition to just looking at work of the industry, you want to be looking at your peers' works as well. So looking at what they're showing on Instagram, how they're showing their case studies on their sites. But really, this is a key thing. So when advising students at Columbia, one of the first meetings that we have to kind of go over their work and the things that they've been doing in their course, it often turns into, what do you want to be doing? Because whatever you want to be doing, that's the work that you should be making. If you want to be designing book covers, then you should be designing book covers and just making that work. And you have these different tools to get that work out there. It's incredibly important to have that sense. And if you're still trying to figure that out, that's a great way to talk with faculty, with students, with career advisors to figure out like what it is you like to do and where it fits in the world. So after you have all of these components, you've looked at your projects that have been archived, you've assessed what you need to say about them and kind of just start with the writing on it. Then go into how do you want to present them? What images, if you're going to document them or if you're going to be showing using mock-ups. Then you're going to want to start to build the actual case study out and sequence the story. So I recommend asking 3 people who know nothing about your project to review your case study. Did they understand the problem you were solving? Do they understand your process? What did they feel was an important goal of the project? Did the images represent your story well? And were there any gaps? So doing this as much as possible with people who know nothing about design can be helpful. And then also having faculty, career services, and your peers looking it over to give feedback. You could, in this process, you could find somebody to say, it looks like you're missing an image there, that you're talking a lot about something and I'm not seeing a demonstration or example of it. You could get feedback where, this image doesn't actually help support the story. I think you need to think of something else or, put something else there. This is a really important and crucial part. This work has to stand on its own because you won't be able to sit with a potential employer or recruiter. It needs to be able to speak for itself and it needs to be a concise story. I went pretty fast, but we can go ahead and open it up for some Q&A. Hi.
Hi. So yeah, I was just typing a few more questions. So if you want to stop sharing your screen so we can just have us up here, unless you want to refer back to something, we can leave that open.
Oh yeah, I think I'm going to leave it open.
Okay,
Right.
great. Yeah, some good questions in our chat. So the first question was from Brenda. Is it an issue if we don't have images to include for the process? I have the final, but my older projects don't have images of the process.
I don't think it's a problem to not have images to document the process. I think you just want to talk about the process. If you have any kind of sketches or even something that's lo-fi to include, I think that works. But really, just even talking about it in the writing can be really helpful to describe it.
Great. Next question is from Gary. Since recruiters will only be spending a few minutes, maybe even seconds on one page, wouldn't it be best to utilize the last format shown with final designs first and then process breakdown later?
Not necessarily. It's got to be whatever feels right for you. If you spend some time looking at various studios and like wherever it is that you might be applying to or to that recruiter, you really have to look at the way they're tailoring their stories and their case studies. That's important. So there isn't a right and wrong for that. I've seen, case studies that go really in depth into that research and really in depth into that strategy. Going back to like expectations for students, there might not be that there, so it's understandable if there would be, in some cases, have that kind of text for a project and others not. Like the example that I showed with the publication design project, that's a pretty quick project, right? It's just 2 spreads, but it has merit and it's worth showing in a portfolio. You just have to think about the way that you're talking about it. What's the problem? What's the solution? And how did you get there? But I don't think there's any right or wrong in terms of the perfect format for how to lay out a case study.
Okay, awesome. This is from Gia. Is it more efficient to have case studies only included in a digital portfolio / website, or are case studies also good to include in a physical portfolio? Would it be too much to include in a physical portfolio?
No, I think that you have to have that in a physical portfolio the same way. It's an opportunity to, if you're making a physical or a printed portfolio, it's an opportunity again to curate, but also you might have some things that you put into this printed portfolio that is not on your website. There might be additional images that are geared towards that opportunity. Or again, if you were applying to be a book cover designer or specifically just publication, you're going to put as much in there as possible. You might show more spreads then for that type of opportunity.
One thing I always encourage my students to do is we frequently make process books, which then it becomes a case study. And I tell them, take them with you on an interview, whether you're presenting it digitally or physically, because if someone asks you about process, you can say, oh, hey, I can walk you through my examples for a project. And that's also really powerful to show that you're prepared in advance for that sort of question.
Yeah, it's good practice for sure. I can say that not every course will have, process work that's due with it. I see that a lot just with students that I advise, but in my own courses, I have process as part of the percentage of the grade just for that, just so that they have that, so they can be able to reflect on it when they're building out the case study or the explanation for the work.
Excellent. All right, so from Brooke, is spec work encouraged for those who are students just starting out or designers who don't have a ton of pieces to show? If spec work is encouraged, are there places that spec work can be done, i.e. 99 designs?
I mean, I don't like spec work personally. I try to discourage students from doing that. If somebody's, I've run into this too, where I'll have, a potential employer have a freelance project for a designer, and what they want this was a direct quote from somebody once, where they wanted to see if it was possible, after a conversation with the student, for the student to be able to spit out what was happening in their brain, and that it would align somehow, and it would be this perfect match. And so that's a problem for me, for a variety of reasons. You know, we're training professionals in schools, and students spend a lot of money on their education, on equipment, and all of the things that went into building that portfolio to begin with. Like, the portfolio is the spec work, in my opinion, and that there's just a lot of red flags with a client like that if they cannot really value the fact that they would have to determine whether the student or whoever it might be the right fit based on their work, and not if they can somehow manage to, you know, give them exactly what they're thinking before being hired. You know, that's something that could come through when you're doing a project proposal, and actually presenting some directions where there's some rounds of review for feedback, but not prior. And I'm not actually familiar with 99 Designs. I feel like it's like a service that aligns you with freelance projects, if I'm right. But
Yeah, I'm not sure either.
I'm not sure, sorry.
All right, so WIG Chicago, how do you account for a user interface work that is live and is developed over time since its initial launch?
Something that's live?
Right.
Yeah, there's different ways to have kind of a video that goes through the actual like prototype of the piece that'll show the interactions, if they're talking about a user interface, if I've got that question right. I think that that's totally applicable to share that, as well as having the flow of the actual piece and showing kind of that flow grid, as well as something that might be even more lo-fi. But if you have this completed piece that's there, first of all, I would recommend showing them where they could find it so they could interact with it themselves. But then even just that video of how it works and kind of going through the app could be super helpful.
All right, excellent. I'm not sure I'm pronouncing your name correctly, so I'm sorry if I mangle it. Venetius asks, is it odd to mix different case study frameworks, publication versus UX, for instance? They require different types of content and presentation.
Is it odd to mix it in like the group of projects? I would say no, and certainly not at a student level. Now, at some point, if you've determined like this is the type of design that I primarily do brand, or I primarily do web work, or or something like that, then that's going to make up the most of your portfolio. But I don't think it's a problem to mix projects, especially in these kind of emerging years. Having examples like it's what's happening in kind of your coursework before you graduate, and having those examples reflected in the work, I think are going to be great. You're going to see projects that will fall away too, where you might determine that you don't do that anymore, but not at this stage.
And I think too, one of the things you have to do when you're putting your portfolio together is you got to decide how to organize it. Do you have a bunch of UX projects? Do you have a bunch of print projects? Maybe then it makes sense to split them up. But if you don't, then I think mixing it together is just the way you're going to have to go.
Yeah. Now, if you also do design work, and you also do illustration, which we see quite a bit, and you might just have one-off illustrations that are not necessarily meant for anything, or maybe you're doing in a way like maybe motion graphics too. You might have a motion graphics reel or something that might be separate on your site. I've also seen, having a tab that's just illustration that kind of shows those one-offs, and maybe there's some, animated GIFs in there or something like that too. That makes complete sense.
Okay, excellent. From the same person, thoughts on how should students handle group assignments?
Yeah, so in group assignments, when you're talking about that project overview, you really want to go into the role. What role did you serve? And I recommend that you highlight the other people on your team. There are practicum courses at school where you might be given a real client. You're working with 6 other people. You know, in many cases, it's just a team of designers. If you have a team of writers and developers and photographers, you know, that are in there, I would highlight absolutely everybody on your team and just be very specific about your role. It's a group effort and you're showing outcomes that you did as a group. But in the way that you're talking about your case study, you're talking about your process, the things that you did and how you got to your outcomes.
All right. This is from David. Should I tailor or specifically curate a printed copy of my portfolio for a specific studio where I might be applying? And there's associated questions from other people. How do you feel about that sort of specificity in preparing your portfolio? One person, Mia, called it thoughts on the love letter portfolio that's tailored specifically to a company.
Right.
And then this, so let's talk about that part of the question first.
Yeah. So there is the AIGA Portfolio Festival is happening right now, and I forgot the speaker's name, but I mention it later when we come up to it. But I watched a presentation today all about the love letter, and I thought that was really interesting. The whole idea there is that you're basically creating a URL that, like, let's say the example that they gave was an internship at Nike. So the URL was like Nike dot, it would be Jo-Nell in my case, .me. And then when you got to the page, it was tailored specifically for that Nike internship. So that isn't even a print portfolio, that's a web portfolio that's like completely live online. And that, you know, that seemed really interesting. I mean, there is a student that I'm working with who would be very interested in having that internship and is making a lot of work that's geared toward it. And also making a lot of fictitious sort of sports work that would be geared towards that. So I did consider that quite a bit today. When you came to the page, to the website, you, instead of just saying like, you know, hello or welcome to the portfolio, it was directed right at the hiring manager, whose name was Julie. It said, hi, Julie. And then it went on to say, these are the things that I make and I'm interested in an internship. And that was right there set above the grid of projects. I think that's interesting. I have questions though. I wonder about what happens when other people are looking at the same site. But I like the idea of tailoring it for sure. And with the printed portfolio, absolutely, you are tailoring it towards that opportunity. That's the benefit of having that base design set up as a publication where you can mix and match and put in things for that opportunity. We work with Handshake at Columbia, and the application materials aren't always just the website. In fact, I would say it's 50-50 where I will see that they're looking for you to upload a PDF of design work. And as designers, that PDF has to be designed. That has to be set like a publication. You'll be judged on that just like you're judged on your resume in its appearance. So yes, you absolutely would tailor it.
Excellent. Also from David, the second part of his question, should I bring full-size versions of my work along with me, like posters or books? And can't I just have a tablet or a laptop with me for an in-person interview and show my website?
It's going to depend on the person reviewing. And again, I think I've seen it in a kind of a 50-50 way that when we have test flight, right? When we had an in-person test flight, which is the portfolio review, for the last couple of years, that's been held at Columbia, and it's been an event that I run. And we had about 50 reviewers from Chicago come and look at work. And some of the feedback was that they were surprised that a student just brought up their website and started walking through it. They were looking for more in that portfolio review. They were essentially looking for a printed portfolio, even if it wasn't a PDF format, but something where you were going to walk through and expand on projects, not just so much the portfolio. In terms of showing it on an iPad, that's fine as long as it's very strategic in how you're showing that work, and again, curated for a specific opportunity.
All right. Carlo asks, with the thinking that your portfolio is your narrative, how deep of a story do you tell? Asked differently, I understand you want to highlight skills you attained in your narrative, but what else do you want to include in that narrative?
It's going to depend on the project, but you're really like you're telling a story. So if it's a brand, let's say, for example, it was a practicum course where you had a client. If it's a brand, then talking about how you conducted research, what sort of brand exercises you went through with a client, with a non-designer, right? How that was communicated. I think all of those are really important elements, especially as students to talk about. And again, it starts to build that story. It becomes more than just, here are some visuals that I made, but here's everything that went into it, and here are all the iterations, you know? So yeah, I think that's an important piece. This is a communication vehicle for you to talk about how you work.
All right, excellent. So from Karen, if we're beginning to dabble in other UX careers like UX research, how should our portfolios change, whether in format, structure, or storytelling?
I think the structure stays pretty similar in terms of building out what the problem is and how you're solving it. If you're going into UX research, then there's a significant more documentation on that research. You know, if you're conducting research in the field, you might have more graphs and data that you're going to be including to show how you got there or how you've made your determinations. But you're still, if you have a website, you're still curating information that's essentially bite-sized. You know, it's not novels. It's got to be something that somebody can be digestible for somebody to review and understand what you were supposed to do, how you did it, and how your outcomes came out.
Okay, excellent. All right, from Brandon, what would you recommend for designers who haven't been able to get a design or project gig? Would you recommend they keep working on their craft and making mock projects on their own and on their own interests? Or would you recommend something else, such as finding people to collaborate with or something else entirely? You know, there's a lot of people out of work right now. As we know, there's a lot of recent grads. So I think these are like some really good things from Brandon.
Yeah, so my first piece of advice is you should be making work all the time. You should be constantly making work and making the work that you want to be doing. You know, you're going to look for some gaps that you think might be in your portfolio that if you are applying to positions, you know, there are ways to kind of go through and see what they're looking for. You know, again, if it's a job that's primarily publication, or if it's something that's primarily brand, like you have to have that work demonstrated and reflected in your portfolio. So if there's somewhere you want to be and you don't have that work, make that work. There's nothing standing in your way of making the work. You don't necessarily, you can have a fictitious client too. You can also, you know, do an exercise. It's a great way to kind of talk about coursework. You know, collaborating with other creatives is, you know, always great. And it also mimics what's going to happen in the real world. You know, if you're able to work with a photographer, work with a writer, or somebody to be able to make a project, like that's only going to benefit you. If you're a current student and you're having trouble finding a position, I would reach out to career services. I would get somebody, even a faculty member too, somebody trusted to be able to help review your work with you and tool it. You know, it's a job finding a job.
Absolutely.
I will say that. And it becomes like the main focus is to try to get everything in order and make it easy for you to apply, and then also be able to keep a record of where you applied and when in terms of doing your follow-up. Utilizing things like LinkedIn, there are a lot of different strategies to be able to do that. But I would seek out some helpful advice to have your work reviewed, and then when, you know, some great things about having career services at your school, if you have a job description and you have your materials, you can get feedback of like, how are these things matching up? Is there something that's missing?
Yeah, and a lot of people are asking questions about, like, if you don't want to do spec work, what are some things that you can do? Do you have a favorite not-for-profit organization that you're passionate about that you want to help? Approach them and say, I'm a new designer. I would love to do this work for you, and go from there, because then you're helping something you believe in, and you're also building your portfolio. You're networking by meeting these people.
Yeah.
The other thing that is there are places where they have like design challenges that's not spec work, but they give you a prompt and then you make the work. So that's another thing. Those can be found online. So those are other ways to beef up your portfolio without going down the spec rabbit hole.
Yeah, there are
All
also
right.
design challenges on Instagram that are pretty great too, because then you
Yeah.
hashtag and people find a whole, pool of people making work. I, can easily fall down a rabbit hole of looking at, specifically, at Columbia, we have a challenge where, I've been meeting with a lot of students who are interested in doing book cover design, and they were kind of like mystified as to how one even does that. Like, do you get linked up with a publisher? Do you do this freelance? Like, this is a very consistent conversation I had it today with a student.
Right.
So we just made a challenge of like, start making the work that you want to be doing. Just do it now. If you've read a book that you love and want to remake the cover, just remake the cover.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it have the correct details. I think, showing it in a mock, and presenting it can be really helpful if you start to build that body of work. Ultimately, now you have a body of work to submit for a position like that.
All right, I think we have time for one last question, and it's a kind of a twofer from two different people, Erica and Tina. Tina asks, do you think it's okay to include conceptual work that never made it to production in a portfolio? And also, what's the best way to include non-design projects in my portfolio? They're design related and complement the design projects, but aren't design projects. So it's kind of a two-parter.
Okay, so the first part, can you say the first part again?
Including conceptual work that never made it into production.
Yes, I would say yes. If it's something you really love and is a great, showcase of your skill set, yes, I think it should be part of the stories that you have. Now, for the second part, if you have, I'm not sure what type of work, but like, sometimes I'll have people who will make photography work, or it could be illustrators, it could be motion or kind of animation. I think that you want to make sure that it's clear what somebody is looking at. So as I said before, if it's if you have a portfolio of motion work and you do motion graphics and kinetic type, then I would have a reel, and I would have that be a tab on your portfolio that you can click on and see the motion graphics reel. And then you use that link to apply for positions like that. If it's illustration and photography, I wouldn't mix that in on the main page of the portfolio. I would have it be sort of another tab in the nav that's going to show you that type of work. I think that I answered that correctly.
Yeah, because the one question was, from Erica was, I'm a new service designer with a handful of not-profit and academic projects that aren't necessarily or obviously design related, but complement the design. So I think you can contextualize that other work within your design work.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, that's great.
All right, we are at 6:55, and I'm again apologize. We tried to get to as many questions as possible, and I tried to lump as many together as possible for all of you. And so I'm going to turn this back over to you. And
okay. All right, so I want to thank you all very much for attending tonight's presentation. I'm going to be compiling a resource document for this event and adding it to the toolkit page on AIGA Chicago's site. There's so many great resources out there. Even just this week in AIGA's Eye on Design, there were some portfolio tips by Meg Lewis that were fantastic. So I'll be putting those in that resource as well. I want to give a very special thank you to Emily Gorski. She is our rock star, recent graduate from Columbia College, Chicago. She's a designer now at VSA, and she's also a volunteer. She's a committee chair for AIGA Chicago. So Emily created the design system for the toolkit series that you see in the presentation and on our social media. And Emily also gave me permission to use her own portfolio site and some of her case studies for this event. So she's extra awesome. And so, hey, as we talked about before, the AIGA Portfolio Festival started today, and it's happening all this week. There are webinars, virtual events, virtual reviews happening until the 18th. And I attended the webinar with Dan Mall today. That's the one that I was talking about, where he was doing the love letter to a potential client. It was excellent. And there is one more virtual event in this series. It is free and you could register at chicago.aiga.org. This next one is on Thursday. It's creating a values report with Mike Josie, and it's Thursday, July 16th. Again, you can go over to AIGA to register. Thank you so much and have a good night.